5 women murdered in less than 3 months, all within a 1-kilometer radius. All mutilated in the same specific way. Scotland Yard had hundreds of witnesses. They had letters from the killer. They had footprints at crime scenes. But they never arrested anyone. 137 years later, in 2019, scientists analyzed DNA from one of the victims. The results identified the killer with 99.2% certainty. But Scotland Yard never investigated this man in 1888. What? London, 1888. The largest city in the world. 4 million inhabitants. Capital of the British Empire. But in one specific neighborhood, reality was different. Whitechapel. East End of London. One of the poorest districts in Western Europe. Extreme overcrowding. Prostitutes working the streets because there was no economic alternative. Endemic crime. Poor street lighting. And in this place, during the autumn of 1888, the murders began. First victim, Mary Ann Nichols. 43 years old. Prostitute. Found dead on Bucks Row on August 31, 1888, at 3:40 in the morning. It wasn't a common murder, not even by Whitechapel's violent standards. The body showed specific mutilations, throat deeply cut, left to right. 2 long cuts in the abdomen. Internal organs had been manipulated with precision. The coroner, Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn, stated the cuts showed anatomical knowledge. They weren't random wounds. Someone knew exactly where to cut. The London Metropolitan Police, known as Scotland Yard, opened an investigation. But in 1888, modern criminal investigation barely existed. There were no catalogued fingerprints, no DNA analysis, no security cameras. 8 days later, second victim. Annie Chapman, 47 years old. Prostitute. Found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street on September 8 at 6 in the morning. The mutilations were more extreme. Throat cut. Abdomen completely opened. Uterus and part of bladder surgically removed. The organs disappeared. The killer took them. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, police surgeon, examined the body. His conclusion was disturbing. The murderer has considerable anatomical knowledge and surgical skill. The British press began calling him Leather Apron from rumors of a man with a leather apron seen in the area. But soon that name would change. 22 days later, not 1 but 2 victims on the same night. September 30th, 1888. The double event night. First victim of the night, Elizabeth Stride. 44 years old. Found in Dutfield's yard at 1 in the morning. Throat cut, but no abdominal mutilations. Investigative theory, the killer was interrupted. The body was discovered minutes after death. The killer fled before completing his ritual. And apparently he immediately sought another victim. 45 minutes later, just 800 meters away, Catherine Eddowes. 46 years old. Found in Mitre Square at 1:45 in the morning. This time the killer had time. The mutilations were the most extreme to date. Face disfigured. Abdomen completely opened. Left kidney and uterus removed. Intestines extracted and deliberately placed over the victim's right shoulder. The coroner estimated all these mutilations were performed in less than 15 minutes. In a public space. In a city of 4 million inhabitants. And no one saw anything. The police panicked. Scotland Yard increased patrols in Whitechapel. They offered rewards for information. They interrogated hundreds of people. 3 days after Eddowes' death, the president of a vigilance committee received a package by mail. Inside, half of Catherine Eddowes' kidney. The letter accompanying the package said, "I send you half the kidney I took from one woman. I preserved it for you. The other half I fried and ate it. It was very good." The letter was signed, "Catch me if you can." Medical analysis confirmed. The kidney was human, fresh, and matched Eddowes' missing kidney. The killer wasn't just murdering. He was playing with the police. And the game wasn't over. After the double event, Whitechapel entered a state of collective hysteria. Prostitutes stopped working alone. Men formed vigilance groups. Scotland Yard received hundreds of letters daily with theories, false confessions, and accusations. But among all those letters, there were 3 that were different. The first arrived on September 27, 1888, 3 days before the double event. It was addressed to the Central News Agency, a London news agency. The letter began, "Dear boss, I keep hearing the police have caught me but they haven't yet." The author described the murders with details that hadn't been published. He mentioned that, "Next time I will clip the ladies' ears off and send them to the police officers just for jolly." And it was signed with a name no one had used before, Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper. The news agency initially thought it was a joke. But after the double event, when they found Catherine Eddowes' body with a partial cut on her ear, exactly as the letter had predicted, the letter was delivered to Scotland Yard. The second letter arrived on October 1st, the day after the double event. It was a postcard. It said, "I wasn't cotting dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time." The third letter arrived on October 16th. It was the kidney letter. Scotland Yard analyzed the letters. The handwriting was consistent. The author knew unpublished details. And most disturbing, he seemed to be planning to continue. But during October 1888, there were no more murders. Police patrols intensified. There were officers on every corner of Whitechapel. Constant surveillance. Systematic interrogations. And yet, on November 9th, the killer struck again. Mary Jane Kelly, 25 years old, the youngest victim, found in her rented room in Miller's Court, Dorset Street, at 10:45 in the morning on November 9th. This murder was different for one crucial reason: it occurred indoors. In all previous victims, the killer had worked quickly in public spaces, always at risk of being discovered. But with Mary Kelly, he had privacy. He had time. And he used that time completely. The crime scene photographs of Mary Kelly are so extreme that Scotland Yard kept them sealed for over 100 years. When finally declassified, forensic historians described them as the most disturbing in British crime history. The body had been completely destroyed. Face mutilated beyond recognition. Internal organs removed and placed around the body. Heart missing. The killer had spent hours in that room. Dr. Thomas Bond, police surgeon who examined the body, wrote in his report, "In my opinion, the murderer does not possess scientific or medical anatomical knowledge. The mutilations were performed by someone accustomed to handling knives, but without formal training." This conclusion directly contradicted previous forensic doctors, who had insisted the killer had medical knowledge. The contradiction was never resolved. After Mary Kelly, the murders stopped abruptly. No more letters from Jack the Ripper. No more characteristic mutilations. No more victims in Whitechapel with that specific pattern. The killer simply disappeared. The police investigation, a systematic disaster. Scotland Yard interrogated more than 2,000 people during the investigation. They arrested more than 300 suspects. They investigated dozens of theories. But they made fundamental errors that would sabotage any chance of solving the case. Error number 1, crime scene contamination. In 1888, the concept of preserving evidence practically didn't exist. When they found a body, officers allowed crowds to approach. Curious onlookers touched objects. Journalists took souvenirs. In Mary Kelly's case, dozens of people entered and left the room before the official photographer arrived. Objects were moved. Evidence was destroyed. Error number 2, lack of coordination. The investigation was divided between the Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard, and the City of London Police. They were two separate forces with different jurisdictions. They didn't share information efficiently. Catherine Eddowes was murdered in City of London territory, while other victims were under Scotland Yard's jurisdiction. This bureaucratic division meant evidence wasn't compared properly and suspects were investigated twice by different agencies without coordination. Error number 3, investigative bias. Scotland Yard assumed from the beginning that the killer was a Jewish immigrant or a mad doctor. These assumptions were based on stereotypes, not evidence. Hundreds of investigation hours were wasted following these preconceived theories while the real pattern was ignored. Error number 4, the letters. Scotland Yard received literally hundreds of letters supposedly from Jack the Ripper. Most were clearly fake, but investigators dedicated time and resources analyzing each one. Worse yet, some letters were probably written by journalists seeking a sensational story. The famous Dear Boss letter that introduced the name Jack the Ripper has characteristics suggesting it could have been written by someone with journalistic experience. If this letter was a forgery, then the most famous name in crime history was created by fraud. During the 137 years since the murders, investigators have proposed more than 100 different suspects. Some were investigated in 1888. Others were discovered decades later by historians and amateur criminologists. Here are the 5 most investigated suspects. Suspect 1, Aaron Kosminski, 23-year-old Polish-Jewish barber who lived in Whitechapel. He was committed to a mental asylum in 1891. Scotland Yard files mention him as a strong suspect. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson wrote in his marginal notes that Kosminski was identified by a witness. But the witness refused to testify because Kosminski was Jewish and the witness didn't want to be responsible for another Jew's execution. Kosminski died in the asylum in 1919. He was never formally arrested. Suspect 2, Montague John Druitt, 31-year-old lawyer and teacher. He had basic medical training. He was found dead in the Thames River on December 31, 1888, apparent suicide. His death occurred a few weeks after the last murder. Some investigators saw this as evidence. The killer committed suicide out of guilt. But there's no direct evidence linking him to the crimes. His family described him as mentally unstable but not violent. Suspect 3, Michael Ostrog, Russian criminal with multiple convictions for theft and fraud. He was known for impersonating a doctor. Scotland Yard considered him a suspect because he had a criminal record and was in London during the murders. But later records showed Ostrog was imprisoned in France during some of the murders. Suspect 4, Francis Tumblety, 56-year-old American quack doctor living in London during the murders. He was arrested in November 1888 for indecent acts, homosexuality, illegal at the time. He fled to the United States before his trial. Scotland Yard sent officers to New York to investigate him, but he was never arrested. Some historians consider him a strong suspect because he had medical knowledge, was in London during the murders, and his flight coincided with the cessation of crimes. But there's no physical evidence linking him. Suspect 5, Walter Sickert, famous British painter. This theory was popularized by American writer Patricia Cornwell in 2002. Cornwell spent millions of dollars on private investigation, including DNA analysis of letters. She argued that Sickert's paintings showed knowledge of crime scenes. But the Sickert theory is widely rejected by professional historians. There's no credible evidence linking him to the murders. Sickert had documented alibis for some of the dates. After reviewing decades of investigation, a pattern emerges. No suspect has solid evidence. All main suspects are based on time and place coincidences, speculative theory, subjective interpretation of ambiguous police notes, in some cases, complete invention. There's no confession, no reliable witness, no recovered weapon, no forensic evidence linking any specific individual to any victim. Until 2019. That year everything changed. A British forensic scientist named Dr. Jari Louhelainen published a study in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. He had analyzed DNA from a shawl supposedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes, the fourth victim. The shawl had been preserved by a police officer in 1888 and passed through his family for 131 years. Louhelainen extracted 2 types of DNA from the shawl. Mitochondrial DNA from Catherine Eddowes, confirmed by descendants of her family, DNA from a man. The male DNA was compared with DNA from known descendants of Aaron Kosminski. The result, 99.2% match. According to Louhelainen's analysis, Aaron Kosminski, the 23-year-old Polish barber, was Jack the Ripper. But here's the problem no one can explain. Scotland Yard never seriously investigated Kosminski in 1888. He appeared on suspect lists, yes, but he was never arrested, never formally interrogated, never surveilled. What? If they had enough suspicion to include him in their files, why didn't they investigate him? And more important, did they know more than they officially documented? Dr. Jari Louhelainen's study in 2019 caused international headlines. Jack the Ripper finally identified, declared the media. But the forensic scientific community had a very different reaction. Several fundamental problems with the DNA analysis emerged immediately. Problem 1, chain of custody. The shawl supposedly belonged to Catherine Eddowes. It was taken from the crime scene by Sergeant Amos Simpson in 1888. But here's the first problem. There's no official documentation confirming Simpson was at that crime scene. His name doesn't appear in police reports from that night. The shawl passed through the Simpson family for 131 years. It was displayed at public exhibitions. It was touched by dozens of people. It was stored in uncontrolled conditions. In modern forensic terms, the chain of custody is completely compromised. There's no way to guarantee the DNA found on the shawl actually comes from 1888 and not from later contamination. Problem 2, DNA contamination. The shawl was handled by multiple people for over a century. Each person who touched it left DNA. Louhelainen argues he used techniques to isolate ancient DNA from modern DNA. But several forensic scientists have questioned whether this is really possible with such a contaminated object. Dr. Alec Jeffreys, the inventor of forensic DNA analysis, stated in an interview, "Without a clear chain of custody, Any DNA result from this shawl is scientifically questionable. Problem 3. Mitochondrial DNA versus nuclear DNA. Lohelainen used mitochondrial DNA, not nuclear DNA. This is a crucial distinction. Nuclear DNA is unique to each individual, except identical twins. It's what's used in modern criminal cases for definitive identifications. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited only from the mother. It's shared by all maternal descendants of a person. This means thousands of people can have the same mitochondrial DNA. A 99.2% mitochondrial DNA match doesn't identify a specific individual. It identifies a maternal lineage. In other words, the analysis doesn't prove Aaron Kosminski was in contact with the shawl. It only proves that someone from his maternal line could have been in contact with it. How many people in London in 1888 shared that maternal lineage with Kosminski? Hundreds, perhaps thousands. Problem 4. Peer review. Lohelainen's study was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. But several scientists noted irregularities in the review process. Critics argued the study didn't provide enough information about methodology. Raw data wasn't shared with other researchers for independent verification. In forensic science, replication is fundamental. If other scientists can't replicate your results with the same data, the conclusion is questionable. To this day, no independent laboratory has been able to verify Lohelainen's results because the shawl is in private hands and access is limited. The real scientific conclusion. The 2019 DNA analysis is interesting but not conclusive. It adds Aaron Kosminski as a possible suspect, but doesn't confirm him as Jack the Ripper beyond reasonable doubt. And this leads us to the most important question. Who was Aaron Kosminski really? Aaron Kosminski was born in 1865 in Kłodawa, Poland, then part of the Russian Empire. He was Ashkenazi Jewish. In 1881, at 16 years old, he emigrated to London with his family. They settled in Whitechapel, the same district where the murders would occur 7 years later. Kosminski worked as a barber. He had his own small business in Whitechapel. By all records, he was a quiet worker living with his family. But sometime around 1888 or 1889, his mental health began to deteriorate. Medical records from the mental asylum where he was committed in 1891 describe his symptoms. Auditory hallucinations, heard voices, severe paranoia, believed his enemies were persecuting him, refusal to eat food prepared by others, feared poisoning, refusal to bathe or maintain personal hygiene, antisocial behavior. The official diagnosis was paranoid dementia. In modern terms, he probably suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Kosminski spent the rest of his life in mental institutions. He died in 1919 at 53 years old from natural causes. He was never violent in the asylum. Never attacked staff or patients. Records describe him as harmless. This raises a crucial question. Can a person go from being an extremely violent serial killer to a peaceful mental patient without any violent intermediate episodes? In 1987, almost 100 years after the murders, a historian named Martin Fido discovered marginal annotations in a police memoir book. The book had belonged to Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, one of the main investigators of the Jack the Ripper case. In the margins of a specific page, Swanson had written by hand, "Kosminski was the suspect." Swanson wrote that Kosminski was identified by a witness as the man seen with one of the victims shortly before her death. The witness was, according to Swanson, also Jewish. But the witness refused to testify formally. The reason, according to Swanson, he didn't want to be responsible for having a fellow Jew hanged. After this refusal, according to Swanson's notes, Kosminski was sent to a mental asylum and Scotland Yard closed the investigation. This story, if true, would explain why there was never a formal arrest. But there are serious problems with Swanson's story. Problem 1. No official witness. There's no official record of any witness who identified Kosminski. Scotland Yard files don't mention this supposed testimony. Swanson's notes were written decades after the events. It's possible his memory was inaccurate. Problem 2. Incorrect timeline. According to asylum records, Kosminski was committed in February 1891, more than 2 years after the last murder. If Scotland Yard really considered him the main suspect, why did they wait 2 years to commit him? And more important, what was he doing during those 2 years? Why were there no more murders if the killer was free? Problem 3. Other suspects mentioned. Police Commissioner Sir Melville Macnaghten wrote a memorandum in 1894 where he mentions 3 main suspects. Kosminski is one of them. But Macnaghten writes that he considered Montague Druitt a more likely suspect than Kosminski. Druitt had committed suicide in December 1888. If Scotland Yard really had a witness who identified Kosminski, why did the commissioner consider Druitt more likely? The simplest answer: there wasn't solid evidence against any of them. They were just suspects among many. Beyond the questionable DNA analysis and ambiguous notes from retired officers, what real physical evidence exists from the Jack the Ripper case? Very little. And what little exists raises more questions than answers. Evidence 1. The knife. The killer used a knife. Forensic doctors estimated it had a blade between 15 and 20 centimeters long, sharp, possibly a butcher's knife or medical scalpel. The weapon was never found. This is strange for several reasons. A knife covered in blood would be difficult to hide in Whitechapel streets. Police patrols were specifically searching for suspicious weapons. How did the killer hide or dispose of the knife so effectively that it was never found? Evidence 2. Blood. The extreme mutilations would have produced massive amounts of blood. The killer must have been covered in blood after each murder. However, multiple witnesses reported seeing men walking through Whitechapel shortly after the murders. None reported seeing anyone covered in blood. How did the killer clean himself so quickly and completely? One theory: he wore a butcher's apron, hence the nickname leather apron. The apron would absorb the blood. Then he could remove it, fold it, and hide it under his coat. But this is just speculation. No bloodied apron was ever found. Evidence 3. The letters. More than 200 letters supposedly from Jack the Ripper were sent to Scotland Yard in newspapers. Most are clearly fake. But 3 letters are considered possibly genuine. The Dear Boss letter from September 27th, the postcard from October 1st, the From Hell letter from October 16th, the one including the kidney. These 3 letters were written in different handwriting. This suggests that they were written by different people, probably all fake. The killer deliberately changed his handwriting. The killer had help. Handwriting experts have debated for decades. There's no consensus. Evidence 4. The graffiti. The night of Catherine Edow's murder, an officer found a message written in chalk on a wall near the crime scene. The message said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The location was significant. A piece of Edow's apron was found a few meters from the graffiti. Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren ordered the message erased immediately. His official reason: he feared the message would incite anti-Semitic violence in Whitechapel. But some investigators have speculated that Warren knew something about the killer that made that message particularly problematic. Was the killer Jewish? Was the killer someone protected who was trying to blame the Jews? The fact that Warren ordered potential evidence destroyed remains controversial. In 1988, the FBI developed modern criminal profiling techniques. Several FBI profilers have reviewed the Jack the Ripper case using modern methods. The composite profile suggests demographics: white male aged between 20 and 35 years, lived or worked in Whitechapel, working or lower middle class, possibly single or with dysfunctional relationships. Psychological characteristics: organized sexual psychopath, above average intelligence, knowledge of anatomy, debatable, capable of blending into the community without raising suspicion, seeking control and dominance over victims, escalating violence. Mutilations became more extreme. Behavior: prior planning, chose vulnerable victims in specific locations, effectively avoided detection, knew police patrol patterns, took souvenirs, removed organs, sought attention, letters to the press. Why did he stop? This is perhaps the most important question of the case. Serial killers typically don't stop voluntarily. They continue killing until they're captured, die, or are physically incapacitated. But Jack the Ripper apparently stopped after Mary Kelly in November 1888. Main theories. Theory 1: he died or committed suicide. Montague Druitt, one of the main suspects, committed suicide in December 1888, a few weeks after the last murder. Some see this as evidence he was the killer, consumed by guilt. Theory 2: he was institutionalized. Aaron Kosminski was committed to an asylum in 1891. If he was the killer, this would explain the cessation of crimes. But this doesn't explain the 2-year gap between the last murder and his commitment. Theory 3: he left London. Francis Tumblety fled to the United States in November 1888. If he was the killer, he simply continued his life elsewhere. But there's no record of similar murders in the United States after his arrival. Theory 4: impulse satisfaction. Some profilers suggest Mary Kelly, the most extreme murder, completely satisfied the killer's impulse. He had time, privacy, and complete freedom to perform his mutilations without interruption. After that masterpiece, perhaps the impulse simply disappeared. Theory 5: fear of capture. Police pressure in Whitechapel after the double event was immense. Hundreds of officers patrolled. Prostitutes worked in groups. Residents formed vigilance committees. Perhaps the killer simply decided the risk was too high. Beyond specific suspects, the Jack the Ripper case reveals systematic failures in 19th century criminal investigation. Failure 1. Lack of forensic science. In 1888, forensic science was primitive. There was no fingerprint analysis. The system wasn't adopted in England until 1901. Blood analysis to determine type, systematic crime scene photography, chain of custody for evidence. Scotland Yard was investigating a serial killer with 18th century tools. Failure 2. Prejudice and distraction. Investigators pursued theories based on class and racial prejudices instead of evidence. They spent weeks investigating doctors because they assumed anatomical knowledge meant formal education. They ignored the simpler possibility: a butcher, slaughterhouse worker, or even a poacher would have the same practical knowledge of anatomy. Failure 3. Political pressure. The case became a political scandal. The British government was criticized for its inability to protect Whitechapel's women. This pressure led to hasty decisions. Commissioner Warren resigned in November 1888, shortly after the last murder. His successor, James Monroe, inherited a chaotic investigation without clear leadership. Failure 4. Lack of resources. Despite the case's importance, Scotland Yard never allocated adequate resources. Most officers in Whitechapel were conducting normal patrols, not dedicated investigation. Only a handful of detectives were actively working the case full-time. And here's the most revealing detail of all. In 1892, only 4 years after the murders, Scotland Yard officially closed the case as unsolved. Not because they'd exhausted all lines of investigation. Simply because they'd moved on to other cases and no longer had resources to dedicate to Jack the Ripper. The most famous serial killer in history was essentially forgotten by the authorities who were supposed to capture him. 137 years after the murders, the Jack the Ripper case has generated over 100 different theories. Some based on historical evidence, others on pure speculation, and some on conspiracy. Let's analyze the 3 most credible theories with their strengths and weaknesses. And then, the twist that could explain why the case was never solved. Theory 1. Aaron Kosminski, the DNA suspect. Evidence in favor. The 2019 DNA analysis links Kosminski to Catherine Eddowes through the shawl. Inspector Swanson's notes identify him as the main suspect, with a witness who supposedly saw him with a victim. Kosminski lived in Whitechapel. He knew the area intimately. A barber would have access to sharp knives and basic knowledge of neck anatomy, shaving cuts. His mental deterioration coincides temporally with the murders. First symptoms of schizophrenia typically appear between 20 and 30 years old. Kosminski was 23 in 1888. The murders ceased and there were never similar attacks afterward. Kosminski was committed to an asylum and remained there until his death. If he was the killer, this would explain why the crime stopped. Evidence against. Mitochondrial DNA is not definitive identification. Thousands of people in London could have shared that same genetic marker. The Shaw's chain of custody is completely compromised. There's no way to guarantee the DNA is from 1888 and not from later contamination. Kosminski was committed in February 1891, more than 2 years after the last murder. What was he doing during those 2 years? Why were there no more murders? The witness mentioned by Swanson was never officially documented. There's no name. No formal statement. It's possible that Swanson, writing decades later, confused details or even invented this story. Kosminski never showed violent behavior in the asylum. 38 years in mental institutions without a single violent incident. Is this consistent with someone capable of Jack the Ripper's extreme mutilations? Probability 35%. Kosminski is a possible suspect but not definitive. The evidence is circumstantial and incomplete. Theory 2. Montague John Druitt, the suicide. Evidence in favor. Commissioner Macnaghten considered him the most likely suspect in his 1894 memorandum. Druitt committed suicide in December 1888, a few weeks after the last murder. The timing is suspiciously convenient. He had education. He was a lawyer and teacher. He had studied medicine basically in school. This would give him the anatomical knowledge forensic doctors mentioned. Druitt had a history of mental instability. His family described him as mentally disturbed in the months before his death. His body was found in the Thames River with stones in his pockets, indicating deliberate suicide. Some interpret this as guilt over the murders. Evidence against. There's absolutely no physical evidence linking Druitt to any victim or crime scene. Druitt lived in Blackheath, several kilometers from Whitechapel. He worked as a teacher during the day. When would he have had time to stalk Whitechapel and commit the murders? His family described him as mentally unstable but not violent. Mental instability doesn't automatically equal violent psychopathy. The suicide's timing could be simply coincidence. Druitt had lost his teaching job a few weeks before his death. This alone could explain his suicide without needing to invoke guilt over murders. Macnaghten never personally investigated the case in 1888. He joined Scotland Yard in 1889 after the murders. His memorandum was based on second-hand information. Probability, 20%. Druitt is a weak suspect. The theory is based mainly on coincidental timing and post-mortem speculation. Theory 3. Francis Tumblety, the American fugitive. Evidence in favor. Tumblety was a quack doctor who sold fake remedies. He had basic anatomical knowledge and access to medical instruments. He was in London during all the murders. Records confirm his presence in Whitechapel during autumn 1888. He was arrested in November 1888 for indecent acts, homosexuality. After posting bail, he immediately fled to the United States. Scotland Yard sent officers to New York specifically to investigate him. This indicates they considered him a serious suspect, not simply a minor criminal. Tumblety had a history of extreme misogyny. He supposedly collected preserved uteruses in jars, according to testimonies from people who visited his residence. The murders ceased after Tumblety left London. There were no more similar attacks in Whitechapel after his departure. Evidence against. Tumblety was 56 years old in 1888. Psychological profiles suggest Jack the Ripper was younger, probably between 20 and 35. He was American with a notable accent. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a man with a local British accent near the victims. No one mentioned an American accent. Tumblety was very recognizable. He was over 6 feet tall, corpulent, and wore flashy clothes. How did someone so conspicuous go unnoticed in Whitechapel during the murders? After arriving in the United States, there were no similar murders. If Tumblety was a compulsive serial killer, why did he stop completely? The uteruses in jars were never verified. This story comes from a single unconfirmed testimony from someone who supposedly visited Tumblety's room years earlier. Probability, 15%. Tumblety is interesting because Scotland Yard clearly considered him a suspect. But concrete evidence is non-existent. Some theories about Jack the Ripper have captured popular imagination but are completely discredited by historical evidence. The Prince Albert Victor theory. This theory, popularized in the 70s, suggests that Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, was Jack the Ripper. Supposedly, the royal family covered up the crimes to protect the monarchy. Why it's false. Prince Albert Victor's official records demonstrate he was in Scotland during several of the murders. There's complete documentation of his location. Letters, public event records, dated photographs. There's absolutely no evidence linking him to Whitechapel or the victims. The theory was invented by an author who later admitted to fabricating evidence. The royal physician theory. A variation of the previous theory suggests the royal family's personal physician, Sir William Gull, committed the murders on orders from the Crown to cover up a scandal. Why it's false. Sir William Gull was 71 years old and had suffered a stroke in 1887. He was partially paralyzed, physically incapable of committing the murders. Medical records confirm his debilitated condition during 1888. There's no documentary evidence of any royal scandal requiring violent cover-up. These theories persist because they're dramatic, not because they have a basis in reality. Here's the question no one has answered satisfactorily. Scotland Yard had resources. They had maximum political pressure. The case was international. And yet, they abandoned it in just 4 years. What? Reviewing historical archives, a disturbing pattern emerges. The social class problem. The 5 canonical victims were poor prostitutes from Whitechapel. In 19th century Victorian society, these women were considered expendable by the upper classes. Contemporary newspapers stated it openly. A London Times editorial wrote, "These unfortunate women chose lives of vice and degradation. Their fate, though tragic, was predictable." Scotland Yard assigned officers to the case because the press created scandal. But internally, many senior officers didn't consider the case a priority. When media attention diminished in 1889, so did Scotland Yard's commitment. The political problem. The Jack the Ripper case exposed systematic problems the British government preferred to ignore. Extreme poverty in London, mass prostitution by economic necessity, lack of social services, police incompetence. Solving the case wouldn't eliminate these problems, but keeping the case open kept these problems in the news constantly. Closing the case as unsolved allowed public conversation to move to other topics. The institutional problem. Scotland Yard made fundamental errors in the investigation. They destroyed evidence. They contaminated crime scenes. They followed theories based on prejudice instead of evidence. If they eventually caught the killer and the case went to trial, these errors would become public. Defense lawyers would use them to argue police incompetence. It's possible Scotland Yard preferred an unsolved case to a case that exposed their own systematic failures. The cover-up evidence. In 1988, almost exactly 100 years after the murders, Scotland Yard opened its Jack the Ripper case files to the public. Historians expected to find complete documentation of the investigation. Instead, they discovered large sections of the files had disappeared. Specifically, reports from multiple crime scenes are absent, witness statements mentioned in other documents don't exist, personal files of several senior officers were destroyed, correspondence between Scotland Yard and the Home Office about the case is incomplete. Why did so many documents disappear? Official explanation: files were accidentally destroyed during German bombing in World War II. But files from other cases from the same period survived intact. Only Jack the Ripper files have these massive gaps. Some historians believe the destruction was deliberate. The cover-up theory. Here's the most controversial theory but also the most explanatory. Scotland Yard knew or strongly suspected who Jack the Ripper was. But the suspect was someone they couldn't arrest for political, social, or institutional reasons. Perhaps he was someone upper class. Perhaps he had political connections. Perhaps arresting him would expose bigger scandals. So they made a decision. It was easier to leave the case unsolved than face the consequences of solving it. This theory would explain why the case was closed so quickly despite public pressure, why Swanson's notes suggest they had an identified suspect but never acted, why so many documents disappeared from the files, why multiple senior officers wrote contradictory memoranda about suspects after retiring. There's no definitive evidence of this theory. But the absence of evidence in such a documented case is, in itself, suspicious. In 2023, a team of criminologists from Oxford University conducted an exhaustive analysis of the case using modern profiling methods and retrospective forensic analysis. Their conclusions. Conclusion 1. Local killer. The killer definitely lived or worked in Whitechapel. The level of area knowledge, specific timing to avoid patrols, and ability to disappear quickly after each murder require intimate familiarity with the district. Conclusion 2. Not necessarily medical training. The anatomical knowledge Victorian doctors attributed to the killer could simply be practical experience of a butcher, slaughterhouse worker, or hunter. The cuts, seen with modern eyes, aren't particularly precise or surgical. They're violent and exploratory. Conclusion 3. Organized psychopath. The killer was intelligent, planned ahead, and had control over his impulses, chose when and where to attack, didn't act impulsively. This type of killer typically doesn't stop voluntarily. There must have been an external reason for the cessation of crimes. Conclusion 4. Probably died or was institutionalized. The most likely explanation for the abrupt cessation of murders: the killer died, was imprisoned for another crime, or was institutionalized in a mental asylum. This makes 3 suspects more plausible than others. Druitt, suicide in December 1888. Kosminski, institutionalized in February 1891. Tumblety, left the country in November 1888. But without definitive physical evidence, exact identification remains impossible. After analyzing all available evidence, we must accept an uncomfortable truth. We'll probably never know with absolute certainty who Jack the Ripper was. The DNA analysis of Kosminski is interesting but not conclusive. Theories about Druitt and Tumblety are plausible but speculative. Scotland Yard's destroyed files mean crucial evidence was lost forever. And most important, 137 years of contamination, reinterpretation, and theorizing have made it almost impossible to separate fact from fiction. Each new generation projects its own fears and obsessions onto the case. In the Victorian era, Jack was a degenerate aristocrat. In the 60s, he was a royal conspirator. In the 2000s, he's an immigrant identified by DNA. The truth is probably simpler and less dramatic. Jack the Ripper was a disturbed man who lived in Whitechapel. He killed 5 women in a 3-month period. And then, for some reason, death, institutionalization, or change of location, the murders ceased. Scotland Yard didn't catch him because 1888 criminal investigation was primitive, because they made fundamental errors, and possibly because political or social reasons made closing the case more convenient than solving it. There's no massive conspiracy, no royalty involved, no great supernatural mystery. Just institutional incompetence, social prejudice, and the passage of time erasing evidence that could have solved the case if it had been preserved and analyzed correctly. That's the truth no one wants to accept, because it's much less satisfying than the elaborate and dramatic theories that have defined the case for over a century. For 137 years, the world has been obsessed with the killer's identity, but we rarely talk about the 5 women who were murdered. They were real people, with families, with stories, with circumstances that forced them onto Whitechapel streets. Let's remember them. Marion Nichols, the first victim. Born Marion Walker in 1845, 43 years old when murdered. She was married for 22 years to William Nichols, a printer. They had 5 children together. The marriage dissolved in 1880 due to Marianne's alcoholism. After separation, Marianne became destitute. She worked in workhouses. She tried to maintain domestic jobs, but alcoholism constantly interfered. In the months before her death, she was living in a charitable lodging house in Whitechapel. She prostituted occasionally to pay for the bed, which cost 4 pence per night. The night of her murder, August 31, 1888, she was turned away from the lodging house because she didn't have money for the bed. She went to the streets declaring, "I'll soon be back with the money." She never returned. Her family learned of her death from newspapers. Her husband identified the body. Her children never reconnected with her before her death. Annie Chapman, the second victim. Born Eliza Ann Smith in 1841, 47 years old when murdered. Married to John Chapman, a coachman, in 1869. They had 3 children. 2 died in infancy. The third daughter, Emily, was born with physical disability. The marriage disintegrated in 1882. John alleged Annie was alcoholic. Annie alleged domestic abuse. After separation, John sent a weekly allowance of 10 shillings. But in 1886, John died. The allowance ceased. Annie sold flowers and crafts on the streets. But advanced tuberculosis progressively weakened her. She couldn't work consistently. She prostituted to survive. The week before her death, Annie was severely beaten in a fight with another woman over a client. She had extensive bruises and possibly fractured ribs. Still, she went to the streets the night of September 8th because she needed 4 pence for a bed. Her daughter Emily learned of her death from newspapers. She never claimed the body. Elizabeth Stride, the third victim. Born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in 1843 in Sweden, 44 years old when murdered. She emigrated to London in 1866 seeking work as a domestic servant. She married John Thomas Stride, a carpenter, in 1869. They opened a coffee shop together. The business failed in 1875. John died in 1884 in the sinking of the steamer Princess Alice in the Thames River. Elizabeth was left completely destitute. She had no family in England, no formal education, no marketable skills. She lived in lodging houses for 4 years. She prostituted occasionally. She tried to maintain relationships with men who could provide her shelter, but her alcoholism interfered. The night of her death, September 30th, 1888, she was seen singing in the streets, apparently drunk. Witnesses reported she looked happy a few hours before the murder. She had no known family in England to claim her body. She was buried in a common grave. Catherine Eddowes, the fourth victim. Born Catherine Conway in 1842, 46 years old when murdered. She had 3 children with Thomas Conway. The main problem: both parents were severe alcoholics. Social services took the children away in 1880. After losing her children, Catherine left Thomas and began a relationship with John Kelly, a dock worker. They lived together for 7 years. They tried to leave London seeking work in the countryside. They returned to Whitechapel in September 1888 without money. The night of her death, September 30th, Catherine was arrested for public drunkenness at 8:30 in the evening. She was released from the police station at 1 in the morning. 45 minutes later she was dead. John Kelly identified her body. He testified before the coroner's court, "She was the best woman I've ever known. If only we could have found work." Mary Jane Kelly, the fifth and final victim. Born approximately in 1863 in Ireland, 25 years old when murdered. Mary Jane is the most mysterious victim because there's contradictory information about her past. Some records say she married young in Wales. Others say she briefly worked in an upscale brothel in London's West End. What's confirmed? In 1888, she lived in a rented room in Miller's Court, Dorset Street. She owed 29 shillings in back rent. She was significantly younger than the other victims. Some testimonies describe her as attractive and well-dressed compared to other Whitechapel prostitutes. The night of her death, November 8th, she was seen entering her room with a man around 2 in the morning. A witness heard a scream of murder approximately at 4 in the morning. No one investigated the scream. Screams of murder were common in Whitechapel during domestic fights. Her body was discovered at 10:45 in the morning on November 9th by the landlord who came to collect back rent. No relatives were located. She was buried on November 19th in a ceremony paid by public subscription. The 5 women shared characteristics Victorian society preferred to ignore. All were poor, all had alcoholism problems, all had lost or been separated from their families, all prostituted by economic necessity, not choice, all lived in lodging houses where they paid by the night, all had tried respectable jobs but circumstances forced them to the streets. They weren't bad women who chose lives of vice. They were women in desperate situations with no options or social safety net. And Victorian society let them die. The Whitechapel murders unleashed mass panic in London. But they also revealed the darkest prejudices of British society. Violence against immigrants. Whitechapel had a large population of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. After the first murders, these immigrants became scapegoats. Mobs attacked Jewish businesses. Men with beards and traditional Jewish clothing were beaten in the streets. Police had to provide protection to synagogues. The graffiti, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," intensified the violence. Although the message was grammatically strange and probably meant the opposite of what people interpreted, it fed theories that the killer was Jewish. Jewish community leaders offered rewards to capture the killer, specifically to clear their community's name. Vigilance committees. Whitechapel residents formed vigilance committees to patrol the streets. In theory, these groups would protect women. In practice, they frequently attacked suspicious men without evidence. Several innocent men were beaten by mobs before police could intervene. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee had hundreds of members. Its president, George Lusk, received the letter with Catherine Eddowes' kidney. Media exploitation. British newspapers sold millions of copies covering the murders. But their coverage was sensationalist and frequently invented. Mutilation details were exaggerated. Witnesses were interviewed who were never at the scenes. Baseless theories were presented as facts. The Illustrated Police News published graphic drawings of crime scenes that were completely fictional but presented as real documentation. This media exploitation established a precedent that continues today: murder as entertainment. The Jack the Ripper case destroyed careers and exposed systematic incompetence in Scotland Yard. Sir Charles Warren, the commissioner who resigned. Warren was commissioner of the Metropolitan Police during the murders. His handling of the case was disastrous. Specific errors. Ordered the Golston Street graffiti erased before photographing it, evidence destruction. Refused to offer reward for information, counterproductive policy. Implemented heavy uniformed patrols that simply made the killer wait for them to pass. Public pressure was immense. Warren resigned on November 9, 1888, the same day as Mary Kelly's murder. His resignation was presented as due to political differences. Reality, he was forced out for his incompetent handling of the case. Inspector Frederick Aberline, the obsessed investigator. Aberline was the chief inspector assigned to the case. He interviewed hundreds of witnesses. He followed dozens of leads. And he never solved the case. This haunted him the rest of his life. After retiring in 1902, Aberline gave rare interviews where he expressed frustration. "I know we were close. We had the name on our list. But something failed. Either we didn't have enough evidence or we let him go for some reason I never fully understood." Aberline died in 1929 without knowing the killer's identity. The coroner's fatal contradictions. The doctors who examined the bodies couldn't agree on basic conclusions. Dr. Llewellyn, first victim, the killer has considerable anatomical knowledge. Dr. Phillips, second victim, the mutilations show surgical skill. Dr. Bond, fifth victim, the killer does not possess medical or anatomical knowledge. These contradictions confused the investigation. Were they looking for a trained doctor or an ordinary butcher? The answer probably. None of the doctors had experience analyzing violent crime scenes. They were making assumptions based on impressions, not scientific forensic analysis. The Jack the Ripper case had consequences that extended far beyond 1888. Change 1. Professionalization of criminal investigation. Scotland Yard's obvious failures forced reforms. In 1901, Britain officially adopted the fingerprint system. Procedures were established to preserve crime scenes. The concept of chain of custody for evidence was created. Formal training for detectives was implemented. All these reforms arose directly from lessons of the Jack the Ripper case. Change 2. Attention to crimes against vulnerable women. Before Jack the Ripper, prostitute murders received minimal police attention. After the public hysteria of 1888, this changed. Not immediately. But the case established a precedent. Even lower-class victims deserved serious investigation. This change was gradual and limited, but it was a change. Change 3. Birth of the serial killer in popular culture. Jack the Ripper was the first serial killer who captured global imagination. Newspapers worldwide covered the case. Books were written. Plays were produced. This established a pattern that continues today: public obsession with serial killers. Criminologists argue this obsession is problematic. It glorifies killers. It forgets victims. And it creates incentive for future killers seeking fame. But the fascination began with Jack the Ripper. The victim's descendants carried shame for generations. In Victorian society, having a relative murdered as a prostitute was extreme social stigma. Families frequently hid the connection. Only in the 90s, more than 100 years after the murders, did some descendants begin speaking publicly about their ancestors. In 2018, descendants of the 5 victims met publicly for the first time at a memorial event in Whitechapel. Joint statement: our ancestors weren't just victims of a killer. They were victims of poverty, social abandonment, and a society that considered them disposable. That's the real crime we must remember. Dark tourism, Whitechapel today. Today, Whitechapel is a gentrified London district. Expensive restaurants, modern apartments. Nothing remains of 1888's poverty, except the Jack the Ripper walking tours. Multiple companies operate nightly tours where guides take tourists to the murder locations. Tours cost between £20 and £30 per person. They generate millions of pounds annually. Critics argue this is exploitation. They're commercializing the brutal murder of 5 poor women as tourist entertainment. Defenders argue they keep historical memory alive and educate about Victorian social conditions. The debate continues. But the fact remains, 137 years later, Jack the Ripper still generates money. The victims generate nothing. They're forgotten except as context for the killer. 137 years after the murders, the Jack the Ripper case remains officially unsolved. Scotland Yard maintains a case file, but there's no active investigation. No assigned officers. No new lines of inquiry. The case is closed in everything but name. But outside official institutions, investigation continues. New technologies, can they solve the case? In the last 2 decades, advances in forensic technology have reopened possibilities that didn't exist in 1888. Next-generation DNA. The 2019 DNA analysis of Aaron Kosminski used mitochondrial DNA. But technology has advanced significantly since then. Nuclear DNA can now be extracted from extremely degraded samples. Next-generation sequencing techniques can identify DNA even in objects over 100 years old. In 2023, forensic scientists from King's College London proposed an ambitious project: reanalyze all surviving physical evidence from the case using 2025 technology. This would include Catherine Eddowes' shawl in private hands, letters supposedly from Jack the Ripper in Scotland Yard archives, victims' personal objects preserved in museums, medical records with tissue samples. The project was rejected by Scotland Yard. Official reason: the case is closed and doesn't justify use of limited resources. The unofficial reason, according to internal sources, fear that modern analysis would expose even more errors from the original 1888 investigation. Genetic genealogy. The same technique used to capture the Golden State Killer in the United States in 2018 could apply to Jack the Ripper. It works like this. Extract DNA from historical evidence, create genetic profile, upload profile to public genealogy databases, search for distant genetic relatives, build family tree backward to identify suspect. This technique has potential to definitively identify Jack the Ripper if evidence with his DNA exists and is preserved. He has living descendants who've sent their DNA to public databases. The problem: the largest genealogy databases, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, have primarily American users. Coverage of 19th-century British lineages is limited. Still, several private investigators are attempting this approach. So far, no published results. Digital forensic analysis of documents. In 2022, digital handwriting analysis experts from Oxford University applied artificial intelligence to the Jack the Ripper letters. They fed handwriting recognition software with the 3 letters considered possibly genuine writing samples from Aaron Kosminski, preserved personal letters, writing samples from Montague Druitt, writing samples from other suspects. The goal: determine if any suspect wrote the letters. Result: the software determined with 82% confidence that the 3 Jack the Ripper letters were written by different people. Conclusion: at least 2 of the 3 letters were forgeries. Possibly all 3. This suggests Jack the Ripper probably never wrote to police or newspapers. The most famous element of the case, letters signed Jack the Ripper, could be completely fabricated. Most serious historians and criminologists in 2025 agree on several points. Jack the Ripper was a single individual, not multiple killers. He was a Whitechapel resident or worked there regularly. He was probably working class. He had no formal medical training. He died, was institutionalized, or left the area after November 1888. Scotland Yard didn't have sufficient evidence to arrest anyone. The case remains unsolved not by conspiracy, but by investigative incompetence and technological limitations of the era. Persistent minority theory. A small but vocal group of investigators maintains that Scotland Yard knew or strongly suspected the killer's identity but couldn't or wouldn't act. Evidence cited. Swanson's notes about Kosminski, Macnaghten's memorandum naming specific suspects, systematic file destruction, hasty case closure. Counter-argument. This theory gives Scotland Yard too much credit. It assumes competence and coordination that clearly didn't exist. In 2025, Jack the Ripper is a multi-million-dollar industry. Books. Over 300 books published about the case. New books appear each year proposing new theories or definitive evidence. Films and series. More than 50 films and TV series. From serious historical adaptations to horror fiction using the name. Video games. Multiple games where you can solve the mystery or even play as the killer. Tourist tours. Jack the Ripper walking tours in London generate approximately £5 million annually. Museums. The Jack the Ripper Museum in London attracts over 100,000 visitors annually. All this built on the murders of 5 poor women who died terribly. After analyzing decades of investigation, evidence, and theories, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Who was Jack the Ripper? Probably a local Whitechapel resident of working class with some type of mental illness. Beyond that, any specific identification is speculation. Why did he attack these specific women? They were victims of opportunity, vulnerable, alone, willing to go to isolated places with strangers for money. The killer didn't know them personally. They were objects for his compulsion. Why did the murders stop? Most likely explanation: the killer died, was institutionalized for unrelated mental problems, or left the area. Least likely but possible explanation: he was identified by Scotland Yard but not arrested for political reasons. Did Scotland Yard cover something up? Probably not a deliberate cover-up of the killer's identity. More probably, they covered up their own incompetence by destroying or losing embarrassing documents. Did the DNA analysis solve the case? No. The Kosminski analysis in 2019 is interesting evidence but not conclusive. The Schall's contamination, use of mitochondrial instead of nuclear DNA, and lack of independent replication mean we can't consider the case definitively solved. Jack the Ripper killed 5 women in 3 months in 1888. 137 years later, we're still obsessed with his identity. But that obsession reveals something uncomfortable about us. We're fascinated by the killer. We forget the victims. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly aren't remembered as people. They're remembered as Jack the Ripper's victims. Their difficult lives, their struggles against poverty and alcoholism, their families who abandoned them, the social system that failed them, all this is ignored. Instead, we speculate endlessly about whether the killer was a doctor or butcher, an aristocrat or immigrant, a genius or madman. We've turned their case into entertainment, into tourist tours, into horror movies, into video games. And meanwhile, the real crime, the social system that created conditions where 5 desperate women were so vulnerable they could be murdered without anyone really protecting them, that crime is ignored. Because it's easier to obsess over a mystery than confront systematic injustice. It's more entertaining to speculate about a killer's identity than recognize that Victorian society considered these women disposable. And it's more comfortable to keep the case unsolved than admit that Scotland Yard fundamentally failed in its duty to protect the most vulnerable citizens. Jack the Ripper was never caught. But in a sense, it doesn't matter. Because the real horror of the case isn't that one man killed 5 women. It's that an entire society allowed it to happen. And then turned those deaths into a story that's been told for 137 years, always focusing on the fascinating villain and never on the forgotten victims. That's the real mystery we should be solving. Not, who was Jack the Ripper? But, why have we never learned the correct lesson from this case? And the answer to that question is more disturbing than any identity we could give the killer. Because the answer is, we still haven't learned. We still obsess over serial killers. We still forget the victims. We still allow vulnerable women to live in desperate conditions. And still, when they're murdered, we ask, who was the killer? Instead of, why did society fail them? Jack the Ripper remains uncaught. But the real crime was never just him. It was us. And that crime continues.